as I would think about my mission of, restorative justice and healing between police and community, it's like one thing to talk about it, but are you going to be about it? And so I thought to myself, well, if I'm really going to be about this, I have to sit down with the officer who shot me, and I have to understand his perspective and his story, even if I disagree with it. Because if I truly want to find a solution, it lies within us, right? And so I want to understand how he truly felt without law being involved.
Leon Ford is a respected activist and mental health ambassador. His story of finding hope and forgiveness after experiencing brutality has touched lives around the world. As a celebrated author, social entrepreneur, impact investor, international speaker, and changemaker, he's on a mission to bring positive change in his community, in the city of Pittsburgh, and beyond. Leon, it is such an honor to have you on the Glory Hour.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Before we dive into your story and about your journey, I just wanted to take a moment and just hear a little bit about your background, a little bit about you. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm born and raised here in Pittsburgh. I grew up on the east side of Pittsburgh, Garfield, East Liberty, Larimer area, and yeah, I mean, I had a good life. Come from a loving family, despite the many challenges that we faced, and so some of the adversity that I had to come through. When I was 6 years old, my father went to prison. He actually wasn't released from prison until I was 19 years old. I lost several friends to gun violence. I lost my baby sister when I was 13 years old. She was 10 years old. She was actually hit by a truck. And then, during teenage years, I was, getting in trouble. I was in Schumann Detention Center twice. And then when I was 19 years old, I was actually shot by a police officer. And that just kind of devastated me and my family. And I found myself questioning God, right? Why did this happen to me? I already experienced so much, trauma in my life. And then, the other thing was, if God was going to allow me to survive, why did he take my legs away from me? And so I was in a lot of pain, but it was really the love from family, love from community, and people reminded me of my heart, right? Like, who is Leon, right? And who has Leon always been before, the world that we lived in, kind of like, almost hardened my heart, right? So I was reminded that I didn't have a hard heart, and that I was a loving, joyous human. And so I welcomed a journey back to myself, right? To understand who I truly was, and a journey back to God, and that faith is what sustained me.
Leon, I just love in the moment you said, who is Leon? Because I know for many of us, the first time we met you, I know when I met you, heard of you, is when, the headlines broke about the story about you being shot by a Pittsburgh police officer. And I just love how just going back and just hearing a little bit of your story of who you are and your upbringing just brings a lot of context and understanding of that. Like many of us, you've experienced trauma. You've experienced a lot of things in your childhood, with your father and your sister. And that just breaks my heart. And I know so many people can relate to that. And so I'm just sorry those things happened to you, just as a young man, growing up and just trying to find your way. And it just seems one thing after the next. And then you have this very traumatic event that took place. And I know I've shared with you this before, but I remember I was 22, 23. I was working in the newsroom when your story broke. And I remember writing the story and hearing about it, and what a moment. And I think it's one thing we hear these headlines, right? But the headlines was your life. And so can you just take us a little bit back to that moment for you that changed your life?
Yeah, so I was 19 years old. driving to my grandmother's house, and I was stopped by two Pittsburgh police officers. Uh, I provided my driver's license, registration, and car insurance. Instead of the officers issuing me a ticket, they ran my name, everything came back clean, and then they decided that I was lying about my identity. And so they told me that I was not Leon Ford, I was Lamont Ford, and began to threaten me, began to accuse me again of lying about my identity. And so for a little over 20 minutes, they interrogated me on the side of this road. Um, once the threats became, more intense, I was afraid. And so I decided to drive off. And when I drove off, one of the officers actually jumped inside of my car on the passenger side and shot me 5 times. Once in my neck, 2 times in my chest, once in my arm, and once in my pelvis. And one of the bullets that went through my chest actually paralyzed me. So it was devastating. And I remember, waking up in the hospital, and uh, one of the doctors, he told me, we have good news and we have bad news. The good news is you're going to survive. The bad news is you'll never walk again. I had no concept of time, but I do remember shortly after that, you know, um, there was a police officer coming in the room taking photos of me, and I found out that I was actually being arraigned from a hospital bed, and I was being charged. And so it was a moment in my life that I would never forget. Um, and it almost broke my family.
That's just that moment when you said it almost broke your family, and just that pause right there. I can't even imagine in that moment of just waking up and your whole life has changed and it's just a whole different fight. And also at the same time, like your son came into the world. So it's like you're having this monumental moment of becoming a father, but then you're going through the fight of your life of just this atrocity and justice that happened to you. So what was that like for you?
Yeah, it was interesting because you know, well, when I in those beginning moments, um, I was so focused on the fact that I was paralyzed, the fact that I was facing prison time. Um, and my parents, none of my family could see me for almost 2 weeks. Yeah, so can you imagine just laying in the hospital wondering, where's my family at? I know they know I'm here, but I didn't know there was like they were not allowed to see me, because I was under arrest. And so we had to hire an attorney to get my parents access to visit me in the hospital. So that was a challenge within itself. Once I was released from the ICU into a regular room, that's when it began to dawn on me. Whoa, I have a baby on the way, right? Because I wasn't thinking about it initially, and so I began to wonder how am I going to be a father, right? Because my vision of being a father, is like playing football with my son and rest, like doing all the things I would do with my father. Um, and so I never, you know, knew anyone who was a wheelchair user or who was a father, right? Who was a wheelchair user. And so I was afraid, I was um, afraid of what that experience would be like. And then my son came, and so he was actually born in the same hospital I was recovering. Yeah. And so they were able to like roll me downstairs to see him. And when I held him for the first time, it changed my life. It was like I had so much anger in my heart. Um, I was depressed. I was, was thinking about, revenge. But when I held my son, it was like he was my angel, right? And um, I thought about how will the decisions I make today affect him, you know? And that was the first moment of like clarity, right, where I really felt the presence of God in my life during that moment. Um, and a lot of times people ask me like about forgiveness and things like that, and you know, a lot of my decisions to forgive and to move forward with, you know, grace, with love, with positivity was connected to my son because I've thought about, you know, what type of leader do I want to be? What type of footsteps do I want my son to follow? There's a pledge that I say every time that I speak. And in that pledge, it says, I cannot teach what I do not know. I cannot lead where I will not go. Right? And so I wanted to lead my son in a positive direction.
Wow. You know, Leon, can I ask what's your son's name?
Leon.
Leon, oh, it's
Yeah.
Leon, it's a junior.
Junior,
Oh, that's
yeah.
beautiful. And so, you know, just even in that moment, hearing your story that in one of the most devastating moments of your life, that in that moment, God had it so that your son, that a part of your legacy, your seed would be right there. And that gave you the impetus, that gave you the drive to say, all right, I need this moment of clarity. Because, I mean, when you talked about rage and emotion, all those things, that's a very, very real thing.
Absolutely.
Just to move forward, and it's for the sake of your son. And so, can you just talk a little bit about, you know, from that moment with your son, but how God really put you on this journey when it comes to healing and forgiveness in a way that is so beautiful? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting, right? Because there were so many things that were just like ordained, right? Like my son being born in the same hospital. You know, he was born almost a month after I was shot. Um, to, you know, teachers coming to visit me. So here's you know, an example. While I was laying in the hospital bed, I remember looking up the articles, right? You know, in the first few articles, was black teen shot by white officer. I Before then, I had never made it a racial thing, but once I saw that, it became racial. Then I would read the comments, and I see your face, right?
Yeah.
So these are some of the most hateful, racial comments about me and my family that you could think of. And so, you know, when you think of black teens shot by white officers, right, and how race could play a part in that, especially a part of the narrative, right, and then reading those comments, I found myself not only hating police officers, but hating white people. But my nurses and my doctors were so nice to me. I said, well, I hate all white people but them, right? And then my sixth grade teacher, uh, she came to visit me. And I was like, well, I hate all white people but her and my doctors and my nurses. And so God always placed people in my life to remind me, right, of the goodness in people.
Yeah.
Because it's easy to have an experience, a negative experience, and say, oh, I don't, you know, and put everybody into a group,
Yeah.
right? But I'm just so fortunate that God reminded me of these special relationships, these special friendships, these special people who just showed up, right, and just were good people, right? They didn't even know what they were doing in that time for me, right? But they were just, you know, loved humanity, right? And this is why, you know, I'm a huge champion for goodness, right? Because you never know um, what prejudice you might be breaking up in someone by just showing up being a good person,
Yeah.
right? And if we want to, you know, model the gospel, right, it's important for us to show up. And like, you cannot underestimate the power of a smile, right? The power of, you know, just being of curiosity, being curious about how someone feels and why they feel, what they feel, you know, acknowledging, you know, their feelings and emotions, and showing up and just loving on them, you know. And I think that's the baseline of, what it means to be a faithful person. And that, again, that is what really sustained me. That is what kept me encouraged and inspired through all of the adversity that I was faced with.
That's beautiful. Just even hearing your story, Leon, and just even the days ahead, and just how God in those moments is showing, like, taking your hardened heart, right?
Yeah.
And you have every right in the world to be like, I'm mad, I'm upset, and angry, but was bringing people to show the love. Like, and I just love what you said about the gospel, about Jesus, and it's about reconciliation and healing.
Absolutely.
And recently, you were speaking at the L3 conference that was held
Yeah.
here in Pittsburgh, and something that really struck me and was really moving is when you were sharing a bit of your story of how you came face to face with the very man that's responsible for you being in a wheelchair and paralyzing you. Can you just share about
Oh, yeah.
that? That's like a beautiful moment. God like brought it all together.
Yeah, everyone thought I was crazy because I would meet different. So over the years, I've built relationships with Pittsburgh police, um, and over the years, I would inquire about the officer who shot me, and finally, I had some folks who made it happen, and so they would meet with him. Sorry,
It's all right. It's
Yeah.
it's okay.
They would meet with him and kind of prepare him to meet with me. So for me, I had already done the work by that time, right? Had already been in therapy and like healing, and I had a lot of community support. Um, and I don't think he had the same type of support I had, right? Um, and so, as I would think about my mission of, restorative justice and healing between police and community, it's like one thing to talk about it, but are you going to be about it?
Yeah.
And my grandfather's a veteran, and he's one of them guys. He's like, say what you're going to do, say what you mean what you say, and be about what you're talking about. And there's no sugar. He's like, no sugarcoating. And so I thought to myself, well, if I'm really going to be about this, I have to sit down with the officer who shot me, and I have to understand his perspective and his story, even if I disagree with it. Because if I truly want to find a solution, it lies within us, right? And so I want to understand how he truly felt without without law being involved, right? Because I understood there's a certain way I had to frame my story when we were going through the legal process. There's a way he had to frame his story, right? So things get a little fuzzy,
Yeah.
right? And so it was important for me to understand his experience so that we could prevent something like this from happening again. And so we met. And when we met, he had like a strong sense of like admiration for me as a human, right? As a man that, really resonated. So he didn't like, a lot of people ask, like, did he apologize? No, he didn't, However, I understood that anyone could just say an apology, right? But when you look into somebody's eyes, when you can pay attention to their body language, it was present, right? And it really showed him that, you know, I wasn't the person, I'm not a bad person. Um, and I think that's true accountability, right? When, it's hard to hold someone accountable when you hate them so much that you avoid them, right? But when you do the internal work, right, and you show up and you don't need an apology, right, but you kind of force them to look at you, right, to acknowledge what they've done, right, it's a different level of accountability. And I do believe, he felt it. Um, and it was liberating, for both of us.
Yeah.
Oftentimes I ask people, can you imagine my quality of life if every time I thought about him or a police officer in a negative light, I was triggered, right? I mean, or every time I saw a police cruiser, I'm triggered and upset and angry. It's not a good experience. And so forgiveness was for me, right? But also for community, right? Because there's like a liberating um, experience when you forgive, right? When you let go, when you um, when you're not held up on a debt that you're like, you owe me this and you deserve. Like some people say, well, God will handle it, and I say, well, that's not my responsibility, or it's not my business, right? To be so held up and to pray and hope that God makes it right. God decides to make it right. That's on God, right? But that that energy, when I hear people say things like that, I'm like, yo, you're still holding on,
Yeah.
right? And so to truly forgive is to like just move forward with your life, and you receive the payment for that, right? Because you have joy, and you have a better quality of life.
Wow. Leon, that was just so profound. Just listening about the forgiveness, like you're modeling true forgiveness in Christ, and He's like the example. And even just that moment with you and the police officer, it's like in the moment, it's like it's okay. You put the law aside, right? And it's about humanity, being humans. And I just want to say thank you for being. I love one of the looking up your bio, like you're an impact investor.
Yeah.
You are investing impact not only in the city of Pittsburgh, but our nation and around the world. And it has been truly an honor to hear you share your story and your journey. And thank you for the example that you have been to all of us. I think you will one day, probably when you get to heaven, when you ever see your crown, that you will see just how many lives you've truly touched. You've touched my life. You've touched so many people's lives. So thank you for the man of God that you are. Thank you for being an example of faith and forgiveness and positivity. But most importantly, thank you for being an example of love.
Thank you, and thanks for having me. And you saying that reminded me of the prayer breakfast that I just saw you
Yeah.
at, and I think Mr. Carpenter,
Reed Carpenter.
yeah,
Yeah.
he spoke about uh, one of his mentors, Sam Shoemaker, and how Sam Shoemaker said that one day he hopes to make Pittsburgh as famous for God as it
Yeah.
is for steel. And one thing that's special about Pittsburgh, even with the challenges that we face, is that there are so many amazing leaders birthed in the midst of those challenges who have the abilities and capabilities, right, um, to lead, right, but not just lead in any way, but to lead people to God,
Yeah.
right, and so I feel as though Sam Shoemaker was on to something big,
Yeah.
and I'm happy that I learned that at the prayer breakfast because it ignited something in me. And I think more leaders in the work should talk about it because we are equipped, right, with the people, the resources, the innovation, the creativity to solve a lot of our problems. But we have to remember God as we lead.
Yeah, that is so, so profound. I think there's an African proverb that says, if you want to go quick, go long alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I think
Absolutely.
that's like going together. And so I like me too, it hit my heart too as well. I'm like, it's powerful that there's a lot that we can do together. So I just, thank you,
Oh
brother.
yeah. There you go. Yeah. So thank you.
Thank you.